Hello, it's Miss Yulbrick here, and today we are going to be walking through our MLA Works Cited Guide. Now, MLA just stands for Modern Language Association. You may also hear or have heard of APA Works Cited page. Now, APA just stands for the American Psychological Association, and this form of writing research is mainly used for social sciences like psychology, anthropology, but with us for our literary and research papers, we will be using the MLA Basics. So, what it is it is a way for us to establish a standard of written communication concerning the formatting of our papers, also applying stylistic techniques such as those abbreviations, footnotes, quotations, but we are really focusing on the citing of sources. You can also use it for preparing a manuscript for publication, but we will not be looking that heavily into it. So the reason why we use MLA is because it makes it easier for readers and audiences to navigate and comprehend a text, specifically your written work or essay. It also helps to give them cues to reference when your information is coming from a borrowed or outside source. So this also helps to give cues to your reader of when to locate that information if it would happen to interest them. It also allows them to focus more on your ideas rather than becoming distracted with the unfamiliar or complicated formatting that you have included in your essay. It also, which might be the most important part of having a works cited page, is that it establishes your credibility or ethos in the field by demonstrating your awareness that this information is coming from fellow researchers. Purdue OWL's online writing lab is the resource that I want to make sure you are all aware of when you come across questions with your MLA works cited page or how to incorporate your in-text citations. This website breaks down the specifics for every source imaginable, whether or not your website has an author, whether or not the website you're finding has a title page. This source is extremely helpful. I was first introduced to it my freshman year of high school, and I'm still using this today, even while I'm working through my master's classes. So that's what we will be covering throughout the rest of this slideshow, but we will also make sure to provide the link for you. That way you can go online here if you have any questions still that are not answered further. Now, when deciding how to cite your sources, you need to start by consulting the core elements. Now, there are 9 specifics that you need to look for in your writing, and the first of those being the actual author of your accredited source. After the author, you want to look for the title of your source, the title of the container, which we will get into more specifics, any other contributors, what type of version, any numbers, the publisher, the publication date, as well as the location the source was created. The first core element to look for is going to be the author. Now, you need to begin this entry with the author's last name, followed by a comma, and the rest of the name as presented in the work. You will then end this element with a period. Now, following the author's name, you will then include the title of the source of your information. Depending upon the type of source, this will determine whether or not you are using italics or quotation marks. So, our first example here of the book titled The Hummingbird House, you would want to make sure you are including that in italics. Then, following a book example, when you are citing an individual web page, you will want to have this marked in quotation marks. However, do not get the web page and the website confused. These are two different sources or different ways of citing. So, for our example below, the how to make vegetarian chili, that's the name of the actual web page, but it is housed in eHow. And this is what MLA considers a container. So just think of the container holding all of your food, and the how to make vegetarian chili just happens to be an ingredient in there. No pun intended. Now, for your third example here, when we are looking at periodicals, this would include journals, magazines, newspapers. These types of articles should be included in quotation marks, as you can see from the third example. Moving on to the fourth and final example, when you are citing a song or a piece of music on an album, you will also want to make sure you use quotation marks. And you can see below the example of one of my favorite artists, Beyonce. So we have her song titled Pray You Catch Me, posted in italics. It's also important to note that every element of your citation is generally followed by a period, which you can see with that example of that song. One final note, it is important to remember that with MLA, you want to make sure that you are including the URLs when citing any type of online source. For the most part, while we are either conducting research or whether or not you're using a book, you will always want to make sure that you are saving or bookmarking those web pages. That way you can access those URLs faster. Now, the next element included in your citation will be the title of the container. So, as mentioned earlier, this refers to the larger holes in which your source is located. So, for example, if you want to cite a poem that is listed in a collection of poems, the individual poem is the source, while the larger collection is going to be considered the actual container. Now, the title of the container, again, is usually italicized and followed by a comma, since the information that follows next describes the container as follows. So we see the example, we have our author, the title of the actual work, and then in parentheses is our container. Moving on to our next example, the container could also be a television series, which is made up of smaller episodes. So, our example, we have the title of the episode. Then in parentheses, we have the actual work, Parks and Recreation, one of my favorites. Now, moving on past our television example, your container may also be a website, which then within that website contains smaller articles, postings, and other works. So for this, the title of our container is NAMI, which is highlighted and italics. Then, in some cases, a container might be within a larger container. I know, this is very confusing. It's reminding me of Inception. It's like a dream within a dream. So, you might have read a book of short stories on Google Books or watched a television series on Netflix. You might have found the electronic version of a journal on JSTOR. So it's important to cite these containers within containers so that your readers can find the exact source that you need. So below again are further examples, and you can also go on to the Purdue OWL website if you have more specific questions about whether or not your source is the title of the work or the title of the container. Now, in addition to your author, there are also other contributors with your source that you want to make sure you are giving credit to. Now, these would include people such as editors, illustrators, translators, and etc. So, if their contributions are relevant to your research, then it is important to make sure you are identifying them in your citation page. So below we have two examples. One is indicating a translated version of the history of insanity. And our second example is showing you that this particular publication has an annotated version. Additionally, you will want to make sure you are looking at the specific version of your source. So sometimes, if it is listed as an edition or a particular version, you need to include this in your citation. So below are two examples where we see the authorized version of one work and also the third edition of another. Now, numbers will be another element that you will want to make sure you're referencing when you're citing a multi volume book or a journal with the different volume and issue numbers, because this helps to make your citation more specific and more accessible for your audience and your reader. So, below we have three examples. One of those would is going to be an actual journal where you can see the volume and the number, as well as a Netflix episode where you can see the particular season and episode, and then finally a actual magazine work where you can see that it is the second volume. The next element to make sure you are looking for when citing your sources is going to be your publisher. Now, they produce or distribute the source to the public. So, if there's more than one publisher and they are all relevant to your research, you must list them in your citation and you will separate them by a forward slash. So, below we have three examples where you can see that when you are typing out the publisher in the citation, you will just keep them at the standard font, no italics, no quotations, but you will make sure that you have them separated there with the comma. Now, following the publisher, naturally, you will then include the publication date in your citation. Now, the same source might have been published on more than one date, such as an online version of an original source. So make sure that you are clarifying the difference between those two dates. So when the source has more than one date, it is sufficient to use the date that is most relevant to your writing, your research, or your particular essay. And if you're unsure about which date to use, go with the date of the source's original publication just to avoid any confusion. So below you can see the example from a television episode, and the publication date is as followed at the very end in a normal standard font. However, it is important to make sure that if you are discussing the historical context in which your episode had originally aired, that you would cite the full date. Now, with MLA, you will include the day first, followed by the month, and then the year. This will also be the way in which we date our header for a final essay in MLA format. Now, the final element of your source will be looking for the location. And this is because we, again, want to be as specific as possible when identifying our work's location. So, an essay or a book article in a journal, you would want to make sure you're including the page numbers. So below you can see the example where we are given the page numbers and the standard font at the very end of the citation. Now, when you are referencing the location for a website, you will be including the URL, but you will remove the HTTP before the beginning of your URL. So as you can see in our example, we just have the www dot followed by the rest of the address. Then below, for our third example, when you are citing a physical object that you may have experienced firsthand, you can just identify the place of the actual location. So below, we are citing a piece of artwork from a particular museum. Now, the next step after you have located your particular sources for your writing, you will then be creating your in-text citation. Now, this will be a brief reference within your text that indicates the source you had consulted. Now, there are a variety of editions when using MLA, but the most current and up to date is the 8th edition. Now, within this edition, you will need to make sure that you are citing any idea, any paraphrased example, a direct quotation to your source. And this is going to help direct your readers to that entry within your works cited page that will be listed at the end of your written essay or work. Now, the author's name and the page number is what you include in parentheses in the actual essay. So below you can see two examples on how to effectively do this. So the first one, we have imperialism is the practice, the theory, and the attitudes of a dominating metropolitan center ruling a distant territory. So that quote is coming from our author said, and it is located on page 9. So that is going to be our in-text parenthetical citation. Then our second example actually shows a different way to do this, where we mention the article first in the sentence, and following our parenthetical citation is just the page number from the work. Now, I've also included an example of what the actual citation would look like on the final works cited page, so you can have an idea of how that would actually work. After you have taken the time to include your in-text citations in the body of your written work or essay, the final step is to then format your works cited page. Now, within your works cited page, you will make sure that this is on a separate page at the end of your paper, and you will make sure you are following the same 1-inch margins. Most of you are going to be using Google Docs, so this automatically does it for you. You will label your page Works Cited. It is not in italics and it is not in quotation marks, but you will have it centered at the top of your page. Then, following this, you will include all of your sources in alphabetical order based on your author's last name. It is important to note that if you do not have an author for your source, then you will be following the next step. So if there's no author, you'll want to look for the title page, and then this will be what you include in that alphabetical order. Now, just like we do with a normal essay or written work, it will be double spaced, but you are not skipping spaces between your entries or your sources. Number 5 on our list of basics. Now, this is important, and we will be showing you how to do this in class, but you will have to make sure that all of your citations are formatted using a hanging indent. Now, this is going to be the reverse of a normal paragraph indentation, where the second line is what is indented. Then, following this, you will want to make sure that you have the page numbers of your sources when needed. If you're only using one page of a printed source, you will only give the abbreviation with 1P. However, if you have multiple pages, that is when you will be using the double P abbreviation. Then finally, if you are citing an article or a publication that was originally issued in print form, then you need to type the online database name in italics. Now, as you can see on this example works cited page, I have my title at the very top, Works Cited. It is in normal font. And then following, I have all of my citations listed in alphabetical order with the actual hanging indentation. So as you can see, this is, like I had mentioned, just the reverse of a normal paragraph where instead of indenting at the very top line, you are indenting the second line.